So yes, this is me. I thought Else was saying that we should say a little bit about ourselves before we start, and I just bunged this on. I thought I might as well. Yeah, just sort of explaining a bit who I am. So you can see there's philosophy in the middle, and then there's all these other bits coming off: psychiatry, law, service user involvement, ancient philosophy, policy, medicine, and all the stuff that I'm interested in. And there's the mental health and justice project as well, and especially mental health advanced directives, as you'll soon see, and neuropsychiatry, neuroethics, personal identity, just anything really. But you know, I'm interested in all this stuff. So I'll start. Hang on, if it works. Right, great. Okay, so this talk really is a follow-on from a study that myself and my group, we've just published recently. I've got all the references and the links at the end and everything. And so this particular, what I'm going to talk about today is a bit of an extension of the study, and it's a sort of more in-depth philosophical exploration of some of the responses that we got. So the quote that I've put up here shows a key finding of the study. And we found, sorry, if I put the microphone down, do I have to hold it, or is it? Oh, I see, okay, right, got it. So yeah, a key finding of the study was that for many people who are living with bipolar, the lived experience of severe episodes of bipolar disorder involves a determinate, unwelcome, and uncontrollable shift from healthy, authentic, and rational cognitive processes of decision-making. And this is going to be the focus of what I talk about. Really sort of reflecting on this idea, what do people mean by this? What light do their responses shed on the lived experience and the understanding of cognitive change within severe illness in bipolar? Before I proceed, I'll just give a bit of background on the study and on our findings. I also, just as a caveat, pointing out from the beginning that I'm using the terms cognitive and cognition in the broadest sense, just really to refer to thinking. With sort of component mental states and mental processes. The other thing is that, as I just wanted to sort of say that I think that some sort of optimism about interdisciplinarity, which is why we're all here. So we often find that despite enthusiasm for interdisciplinarity, people can be skeptical about the rigor or the potential impact of interdisciplinary work. And there can be pessimism amongst those who work in interdisciplinary fields about getting their work into the mainstream and bringing it to the attention of people in different disciplines. So this study itself was based primarily on qualitative methodologies, and it brought together philosophy, law, medicine, lived experience, and fortunately, we managed to get it published in a really high impact medical journal, which was great. So I think that it shows, you know, it was wonderful when it happened. It's generated loads of interest. And I think it shows that there is an enthusiasm out there for this type of work and for the potential impact that it can have. And, you know, I think that people have been very, very receptive, and they can see that actually bringing disciplines together properly can advance thought beyond what individual disciplines can do. So if nothing else, as a takeaway message, I hope that, yeah, optimism about interdisciplinarity. So this is really what it was about. The survey was about, well, this study itself, which was part of a larger survey, was about service users with bipolar disorder want to choose enforced treatment ahead of future episodes. So it focused on this issue of a self-binding directive. And what this is a type of advanced directive where it allows someone who's got an episodic mental health condition like bipolar, to make a request for involuntary treatment in advance. And what we've got there as the image was courtesy of King's publicity, but also we had an artist who worked with us during our research, and she also published, I've put the reference at the end, she published some of her pieces, which are amazing. This is one of her sketches, and there were some sculptures, and she published them alongside, and it's, it's a fantastic experience to have that and really sort of brought it to life. So why would people want this type of thing? Well, generally, we found that it's because past experience of being severely unwell has shown them that when they're very unwell again, it's very likely that they're going to refuse or resist treatment. And if they don't receive treatment, that it's going to have very harmful consequences for them. And so they want to sign up for sort of advanced instruction that someone treats them, even if they're resisting it at the time. And we conducted this large survey via Bipolar UK, which is the UK's largest charity for people with bipolar. The inclusion criteria were having a professional diagnosis of bipolar disorder. And the results that we found in relation to self-finding directives, we found that a large number endorsed. So of the people who provided free text responses, which is what we've analysed here, 82%, 463 people endorsed that. There were 65 people, 11.5% rejected, and a smaller number were ambivalent. So the majority endorsed. Having said that, there were some very strong and very distinct reasons given by those who rejected or those who were ambivalent, and I will talk about those as well. So the key idea that really came across, and the one that I'm going to be talking about a little bit, we asked people, if you endorse this or you reject it, why? What's the reason? And the key reason that people gave, the one that came across most strongly, was a notion of what we termed distorted thinking, which we took from one of the quotes. So a person going through a manic episode has, by definition, seriously distorted thinking. If a person's manic to the extent they can't make their own decisions, then again, by definition, they're not in a right mind to refute their advanced care plan. Otherwise, it's basically worthless. And this theme of distorted thinking when unwell, there were a remarkable variety of articulations, but this idea came up in, well, about 411 of the 400, of course, this is not precise science, but we did do a lot of sort of cross-checking within the quantitative analysis. We made it very rigorous. So as precisely as we could say, 89%, 411 of those people who endorsed, this was their primary or their sole reason that they gave. Which is interesting because most people think about self-binding directives. Yes?
So can I just clarify, will they be involved if they endorse this as a kind of thing to be offered in general, or something they want themselves about?
Would they think, I suppose both actually, do they think for themselves, well, is it a good idea? People responded, it was sort of open in that it was, do you think it's a good idea? And people responded very much talking about themselves, although some people spoke much more generally as well. So for example, this answer, a person going through a manic episode, a lot of people spoke about themselves, but also spoke about bipolar in general as well. So both really. So yes, we found that this was the sort of the key or the sole reason, and actually quite a lot of people, so I was saying, people think of self-binding directives as something very much motivated by the desire to avoid the harmful practical consequences. So, for example, someone who, when they're manic, they find that they spend all their money, or someone who's worried about the suicide risk when they're severely depressed, those types of things. But we actually found that what people talked about most when they gave their reason why they thought this was a good idea wasn't anything to do with those things. It was actually about what happens to their thinking, that their thinking is distorted. And this was very striking. Also, we found that amongst those who rejected, the very opposite notion came up quite prominently as well. So valid thinking when unwell. A lot of people, the reason they rejected was because, well, for example, I think how a person is feeling in a crisis is valid. Okay. So as I said, there were lots of different articulations. Some conclusions from the study, sort of main conclusions we found, lots of people with lived experience think that self-binding directives are a good thing. We should, therefore, we think, have clinical and legal provision for self-binding directives. And also, we can't simply assume that what everyone wants from a mental health advance directive is to avoid hospitalization and avoid involuntary treatment. So for a long time, advanced directives have been seen in that light in mental health context as a way of reducing coercion and reducing hospitalization. But here we had a bunch of people with very severe health conditions who were saying, actually, we want the opposite. And so, we see that big implications for assumptions about human rights, international assumptions about human rights, where involuntary treatment and the idea that someone's lacking in decision-making capacity may well be seen as a fundamental violation of human rights. But at the same time, there was, no one-size-fits-all solution, and many people didn't feel this way as well. And it's very important to acknowledge that. This is an example when the study came out. So you can see someone, I've redacted who they were, but someone said, really interesting study, Tania, and then another person said to me, well, as a high-functioning bipolar, I'd be offended if this were offered to me, which I think sort of captures how the difference of opinions. And the, so, yeah, as I say, the most striking thing, this idea was a major determinate shift in distortion of thinking and decision-making abilities occurring when unwell. And this is all the more striking because mental health laws that the people are used to, and this is the same internationally in almost all jurisdictions, are based not on thought processes, not on decision-making capacity, but on notions of risk. So mental health laws are based on assessment of mental disorder and risk rather than decision-making capacity. Nevertheless, people themselves, when asked, why would you want one, were talking about this very notion of losing the capacity to make decisions. Just the background on that, I mean, I won't go through all the details, but so, for example, in England and Wales, Mental Health Act 1983, that we are governed by, governing informed treatment without informed consent is on the grounds of risk, well, status, having severity of mental disorder to a certain degree, but also the interests of safety, risk to oneself or to others, are the grounds for detention and involuntary treatment. Most of the time in the context of physical illness, things come under the Mental Capacity Act, and there it's about functional decision-making abilities. Does the person have the capacity to make a specific decision at a specific time in relation to treatment or in relation to other matters, not about risk? So I think then to me, when I looked at all the responses that we had, I think the three key questions that really keep coming up, well, this idea about cognition and values. People talk about so seriously distorted thinking, you're unwell and you lack capacity. When I'm unwell, I wouldn't be making the right decisions. And we can see there from the term right, that this isn't just about, it sounds on the one hand as if it's a sort of value neutral idea, question about rationality and reasoning, but actually, we'll see more about this as we go on, but you can see as you look at the answers that they're very, very distinctly underpinned by an evaluation of thinking, which determines whether that thinking is rational or not. Then there's, I'll explain more about this when I come to it, but this notion that distorted thinking is a harm in itself. If people are justifying this, not on the notion that it will stop them from spending all their money or reduce suicide risk, those sorts of things, but actually because they're worried about this phenomenon of distorted thinking, does that mean that they see distorted thinking as a harmful outcome in itself? And if they do, what does it mean? And then finally, this notion of a shift of state. So someone said being well and not being well are quite different states. And this idea comes across from lots of the answers. So what is it? What's this change in state that's happening? And finally, for all of these questions, really, can these responses that people gave help with some dominant sort of medical and medico-legal controversies? So distorted thinking when unwell as a reason for endorsement. We found that we could, this is a sort of further analysis. I found I can divide it into sort of 6 main interrelated categories of the reasons that were given under distorted thinking. And I'm going to go through them very briefly. We had 3 that were quite broad and 3 that are more narrow. And they draw on the initial coding of the survey data that I did with my co-authors. And some responses incorporate multiple reasons, quite a few of them. So the first 2 in particular, the first 2 categories, the validity of thinking when well and impaired decision-making, they're quite clearly linked to all the other categories. And so here's validity of thinking when well, which was the first one. So for example, because when you're very unwell, your thinking can be so deluded, you might just want to do or try anything that when you were well, you thought would not be wise. So this very strong distinction between how I think when I'm well, which is correct, and how I think when I'm unwell, which is distorted or invalid or however it was described. And once again, as I said, this implies a sense of objectivity, value, neutrality, these terms reasoning, right, correct, rationality. But actually, then people are using all the time terms like true or real or authenticity or wise, and all of these point to a notion of making an evaluative judgment about what's happening. And sometimes it's very explicit, sometimes it's more subtle. So someone said, you know, because when I'm in a depressive state, I want to die. When I'm not, I don't. I'm a different person with different thoughts, feelings, and reactions when I'm depressed or even manic. And it wouldn't be fair if I'd stated in my care plan to persist in treatment to get better, but was refused because of my depressed or manic state. So it's not that being in a depressive, it's not that the desire to die is necessarily per se irrational. It's the person is evaluating in that way. When I'm well, I don't want to die. That's true, that's authentic, that's correct, that's real, that's valid. When I'm depressed, I want to die. That's a distortion. So even with this kind of thing, you can see very strongly that there's an, I mean, it may be an evaluative dimension that most people would, you know, concur with, but nevertheless, it is an evaluative judgment on the person's part. Similar pattern with the other categories. So impaired decision making, this came up a lot as well. And I've put here from functional abilities to values once again. So someone said during manic episodes, it's impossible to make the right decisions about treatment. A lot of people spoke very explicitly about decision making. And you know, I've got here from the Mental Capacity Act, your decision-making abilities are seen as impaired if, because of an underlying mental disorder, your abilities either to understand or to retain or to use or weigh the relevant information and to communicate your decision, or, you know, in the states with competence, people talk about reasoning and appreciation, but a similar sort of concept. And people in our survey said, you know, in episodes of mania, you have no understanding. When I'm unwell, I frequently change my mind. When I'm unwell, I might not be able to appreciate what's right or be able to convey it. So you can see all of those ideas very strong. And on the one hand, it seems to, you know, very clearly point to the underlying structure of the notion of mental capacity and imply the, you know, functional abilities and value neutrality that is implicit in the notion of mental capacity. But at the same time, we see then rational, people talk about sensible, positive, appropriate decisions, and irrational as stupid risks and bad decisions and poor decisions. So you can see there once again this notion of values. And the same thing, impaired reasoning. When you're unwell, you cannot think rationally. When I'm well, my views may change, but probably not rationally, thinking straight. My decisions are unsound, not capable of clear logical thinking. So once again, you know, this notion of objectivity, value neutrality, perhaps at first glance, but once again, can't make wise decisions, can't make sensible decisions. When I'm unwell, don't have the right perspective. Once again, this idea of values. And also I was talking earlier on about the shift of state. So e.g., you know, you can become another person and irrational. This idea that there's a complete shift. And these were the final three categories, and the sort of more specific things. So specific illness states, really people, you know, people sort of talk all the time about how psychiatric classifications and the terminology used in psychopathology and the concepts don't reflect lived experience and fail on those grounds. But what we had was people, you know, people bringing forward these concepts as a way of explaining what was happening to them. So paranoia can cloud everything. You know, when I'm in a depressive state, when I'm manic, the notion of insight, this idea that, you know, the person doesn't understand, they have no awareness of their illness. Well, you know, lots of people had answers like this, because when I'm ill, I don't think rationally, and I don't accept that I'm ill. And so you can see there, once again, all of these things coming out, and altered identity, which was very striking as well. When I'm manic, I'm not myself. My judgment's not only impaired, it's destroyed. And there were lots and lots of different people who responded in terms that referred to notions of personal identity and selfhood. And as I said before, not everyone feels this way. So, you know, we have people still have valid views, even when manic, lots of quotes like that. there's one on the left-hand side, got one of the ones that sort of supports the distorted thinking notion. On the right-hand side, one of my favorite quotes from the whole survey. So I'm wary of being hospitalized when I'm manic. This was someone who rejected, because I don't feel that it's a destructive part of my illness. In fact, I enjoy it. I'm happy, I'm productive, and I move my life on in important ways, which I can't do in hospital. However, I'm well aware that psychiatric professionals all see mania as very destructive, even though my most destructive behavior is by far when I'm severely depressed. So, you know, even if you were sort of questioning the evaluative notion underpinning things with the distorted thinking answers, when you come to this, you can see just how much values, individual values, are at the heart of the decisions that people, the responses that people are giving here. So we'll come back then to these three questions. And first of all, I'm going to think about cognition and value. So bipolar disorders usually classed as a mood or an affective disorder, but alongside mood and behavior, cognitive impairment is also very significant. For example, classificatory criteria, racing thoughts, distracted easily, or diminished ability to think or concentrate, or indecisiveness. So very much the sort of cognitive dimension coming out. Another element is the idea of change. Change and a dramatic shift is also fundamental to classifying and diagnosing bipolar illness. So the notion of bipolar episodes is that they involve a dramatic shift in thinking and beliefs and behaviors. And this has been central to understanding bipolar in psychopathology. Take the DSM, for example. 3 or more of the following symptoms must be present and represent a significant change from usual behavior. And the ICD-10, mood episodes drastically different from the moods and behaviors that are typical for the person. So we've got an emphasis on cognition, but also very much the inextricability of cognition and values coming out here. And want to think about, how can this model of cognitive impairment and decision-making capacity, which people seem to be pointing towards, and is supposedly a value-neutral concept, how can it accommodate values? So, how might values and cognition work together here? And I think, first of all, it's important that there's two different ways of thinking about value, a differentiation to make here. And the first is about what happens while the person is unwell. And this is about a shift in their values and beliefs and the evaluation that professionals and the person themselves makes at the time of that shift in values and beliefs. So someone from the survey says, when a person's unwell, they may lose insight and act in a way that's contradictory to their usual behavior, beliefs, and wishes. And this has been very much part of the classification and diagnosis of bipolar, that someone who's very unwell, you see pretty much a personality shift, values, beliefs, all of these elements shift, relationships with other people. And whether you deem someone to be unwell and whether you assess them as lacking in the capacity to make a decision about treatment is very much based on the clinical evaluation of the person's values and beliefs while they're unwell, and especially the extent to which these differ from their values and beliefs while they're well. But then, at the same time, at the heart of the notion of mental capacity and mental capacity assessment is the idea that this is value neutral. So the Mental Capacity Act has its core principle. A person is not to be treated as unable to make a decision merely because he makes an unwise decision. So you don't decide whether someone has capacity or not based on how you evaluate their decisional outcome. You can only do it if you can see, and that's all very well if someone can't remember things, if they've sort of some neurological condition which is affecting their ability to communicate, their ability to remember. But once you get to things where it's much more contingent on noticing that someone's values or beliefs are distinctly different from the values, and it becomes a lot more difficult. And there's a lot of critique of the notion of decision-making capacity in the context of mental illness because of this, because of the inseparability of values and cognition. So people ask, what about values? And they say that this means that the notion of decision-making capacity is a bad fit for the lived experience. which is strange because here's all these people with lived experience saying that actually I lose capacity. So what we want some way that we can have both those things. We can have a notion of decision-making capacity, but we can also have the idea that losing capacity and having values are part of lived experience, and they can all be together. So I've got a quote here from Fulford. Psychiatry is more value-laden than any other branch of medicine, essentially because it's concerned with areas of human experience and behaviour in which human values are particularly diverse. And I would very much recommend the work of Louis Charland on values and decision-making capacity and mental disorder. I've put some references at the end. The next way of thinking about values here is the retrospective element. So the individual's own retrospective evaluation of these shifts in values. You know, how does the individual, when they're well, think about what happened to their values and beliefs when they were unwell? And for a lot of people, they gave a negative evaluation of it, this idea that their thoughts were distorted, that they'd lost decision-making capacity in relation to treatment. But for quite a few people, they gave a positive evaluation. They recognized the shift, but this was still valid, this was valuable. They retained capacity when they shifted. And I think that one of the things this points to is how integral to our understanding. Well, firstly, how integral to our understanding of the notion of decision-making capacity and individuals' values are, and also how we need to see the individuality of capacity assessment. And we've been working on this idea of personally guided capacity assessment, where people reflect on previous episodes of illness and think about what they consider as the marked features of what constitutes loss of capacity for them, or doesn't constitute loss of capacity for them, and can put that into an advanced directive, which can then be used, incorporated into assessment while they're unwell. And then, this idea, what does it mean for it to be, for distorted thinking to be a harmful outcome of illness? So typically in psychopathology, people think about mental states, mental processes and behaviors as symptoms, but then there's a distinction drawn that the mental states and the processes are the phenomena that cause the behaviors which are the harmful outcomes. But what we have in the responses is a suggestion that, well, yes, mental states, mental processes, behaviors, they're symptoms, but actually mental states and processes themselves are harmful outcomes in themselves. It's not just the fact that they lead to these behavioral outcomes. And, I say this is as strange as it sounds. Well, I don't think so. When you think about physical illness, you think, for example, the symptom of pain. Pain is a mental state. But it's easy to see that pain as a mental state is both a symptom and a harmful outcome in itself. But then when it comes to mental illness, so why can't we say that, you have distorted thoughts and cognition, and that is a mental state, mental states and processes, and it's a symptom, but at the same time, why can't that also be a harmful outcome in itself? And that seems to be what the people are talking about. And it's this suggestion that there's some qualitative shift, and this qualitative shift in itself is experienced as a harmful outcome, not just in terms of the sort of behavioral outcomes and the practical outcomes that it produces. And then finally, I come on to the thing about states. So being well and not being well are quite different states. What does it mean? What is this change in state? So it seems like people are talking, when they say different state, it seems what people are talking about is some kind of global transformation. And it does seem to be describing a mental state or process, a mental transformation. But at the same time, it doesn't seem to be describing, or it seems to be describing much more than individual mental states or processes as they're usually seen in philosophy or in psychiatry within a mental state examination. It seems to be describing a much more sort of global qualitative phenomenon. So how do we get from this notion of lots of sort of altered values and beliefs and cognition to a global qualitative transformation, a different state? How does that happen? And this is my final sort of just throwing this idea in. So yeah, one of the things I'm very interested in is personal identity. And for me, these ideas really sort of conjured up some thoughts about Parfit, strangely. So his notion of great discontinuity and this sort of change from, so Parfit has this notion about how an individual's identity, well, not identity, sort of, you know, how the sort of psychological continuity shifts. And one of the ways that this can happen is with what he terms a great discontinuity. And he uses the example of St. Francis of Assisi, who, you know, one moment is walking around as a young man in the town, seducing all sorts of women, spending all his parents' money, and then, I don't know, suddenly becomes unwell and, you know, has a word with God. And in those days, doesn't get sectioned, but actually, you know, instead, he becomes a great leader and, you know, he's canonized, and he renounces all his earlier ways. And it happens very suddenly. It's a sudden shift, a great discontinuity. What happens with this? Well, change is the core feature. The change, it's rapid and it's sudden. There's shifting individual psychological continuities, things like values, aspirations, character, emotions, relationships, all the things that Parfit describes as what matter to us. And there's the quantity of discontinuities significantly outweighs the quantity of continuities. And it all happens very rapidly. But although that's a quantitative thing, it can be described as a qualitative change of self. If the change is so marked and so sudden, then Parfit says, well, you would say that the self, it's a different self. I mean, he doesn't mean that in the sense of some separately existing metaphysical entity, but at least insofar as we understand selfhood, there is a change of self. And, you know, so does this notion of great discontinuity fit with the lived experience as described here? And it seems on the one hand, it very much does. People say, when I'm manic, I'm not myself. I know that I'm not myself when I'm unwell. But then once again, I bring us back to finish, I bring us back to the person who said, well, you know, I'm wary of being hospitalized when I'm manic. It's not destructive. I enjoy it. I'm happy, productive. Well, what's happening there? They recognize a big shift, but for them, perhaps it's not discontinuities. They see these shifts as continuities. It's part of themselves. When they're well, those are continuities. They're different, but they're continuities with what they understand as their self. So I think that actually the great discontinuity model can work for both, can work as a sort of explanatory model for both sort of sides, for the people who see this as transformation of self and for the people who don't see it as a transformation of self. Finally, you know, obviously all of this has huge implications for thinking about decision-making capacity, for cognitive impairment, for values in bipolar, mental illness. For me, I'm very interested in what implications it would have for dimensional or continuum models of mental disorder, for this notion that mental illness is simply an extreme variant of ordinary human experience, because that doesn't seem to be at all what a lot of people are saying here. It seems to be utterly different, the very opposite of how they themselves experience their illness. And I will leave it there, and thank you very much.